us. We'll get started to keep our session going on time. I am Dr. Danielle Ludwin. I'm an associate professor of anesthesiology at Columbia University in New York City. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sean Mackey. Dr. Mackey is the Redlich Professor and Chief of the Stanford Division of Pain Medicine. He uses research tools like big data, psychophysical, neurobehavioral, and neuroimaging tools to investigate chronic pains and opiates. He's the author of over 200 journal articles and book chapters and is the developer of an open source learning health system, Choir. And this was developed to transform the care of people with pain and serve as a platform for research in real-world clinic patients. He recently co-chaired the HHS-NIH National Pain Strategy, and under his leadership, the Stanford Pain Medicine Center has been twice designated a center of excellence. He has served as a principal investigator on multiple NIH awards. Today, he will be speaking on pain outcomes, patient registries, and learning health systems, delivery of best pain care at lower cost. As a reminder, I just want to let you know today's session is being recorded, and at the conclusion of the session, we'll leave about 10 minutes for questions and answers. And of course, Dr. Mackey will be happy to answer any questions if we're not able to get to something during that time frame. I'll also ask you to please remember to silence your cell phones. And there is one important thing I also forgot to mention. He is the proud father of a 22-year-old who is a social media guru.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, thanks everyone. Thanks for being here. I was asked to talk about an area that's become a personal mission in my life, and that is just answering this very simple question: are we helping our patients get better? And what does better really mean? And I'm going to take you through some of the journey that I've had on this and some of the directions that we've been going. And I'm going to be using a system that we developed as a use case for it. By no means is the only way of doing it. And by the way, let me just share with you that I'm not trying to sell you anything, because everything that we do is free, and we post it and give it away. So by way of additional background, I am a physician scientist. I take care of patients typically 3-4 days a month now, and the rest of the time is in the lab. And for any of you who are on Twitter, the handle's at Dr. Sean Mackey, so feel free to tweet it out. Disclosures-wise, I have no industry conflicts of interest. I take no industry money. I haven't for a very long time now. All of my conflicts are with the NIH, as we all struggle to become more conflicted by them. If you've seen a version of this talk before, I frequently start off with this slide because it serves as a great use case, and that being a patient example. And I choose Sandra here for the simple reason that she's given me permission to talk about her behind her back. And Sandra is a young woman who has complex regional pain syndrome, a variant of neuropathic pain that happened when she was a college student about 12-13 years ago. She has this condition that leads to terrible burning pain in her foot. This looks like an acute injury, but in fact, she's had this now for over 10 years. It has subsequently spread to her upper extremities. She lives in Florida, where she works at Walt Disney World for the Magic Kingdom, and she flies out to see me on a regular basis to get treatment. And Sandra represents a typical patient we see in the clinic, and the typical patient we see in many healthcare situations where we're faced with this challenge: how do we really know whether we've made Sandra better? And how do we know when a particular treatment is better for Sandra than for somebody else, and under what circumstance? And where I started with this was when I first came on as a faculty member. Now, 20 years ago, when Ron Pearl was taking over his chair, he came to me and he said, "Sean, how do you really know you're helping any of your patients get better?" Now, you got to understand, Ron is a cardiac anesthesiologist and intensive care doc, so he has clear metrics. He knows exactly what a patient getting better means. And I looked at him and I said, well, they give me nice bottles of wine, and I get fruitcake over the holiday, and they give me hugs. I get hugs. And I think, that's a surrogate measure of it. And he's like, oh, come on, how do you really know they're getting any better? And I realized I didn't, so it set me on this journey to figure this out. And I realized at that time that much of my sense of whether they were getting better, as well as for much of healthcare, is based on this belief. I've really been fond of this quote from George Bernard Shaw: "There is no harder scientific fact in the world than the fact that belief can be produced in practically unlimited quantity and intensity, without observation or reasoning, and even in defiance of both, by the simple desire to believe, founded on a strong interest in believing. It's a mouthful, but I think it sums it up very nicely. Much of what we have done in clinical practice is based on pattern recognition intersecting with our beliefs. I'm using pain here also as a use case, but this talk is by no means focused on pain. For those of you who are operating room anesthesiologists, almost everything I'm saying will fit into that world as well as almost any other clinical situation. When starting off, why pain? Well, there's a huge problem with pain in our society. I helped co-author the Institute of Medicine report on pain. In that, we did an econometric study, 100 million Americans living with chronic pain, $500 billion a year we spend in chronic pain. One of the main issues that we came up with is that the quality of the data that we have in pain, the incidence, the prevalence, what works for whom, longitudinal outcomes, terrible, terrible quality. We followed this up with a more recent study that defined this condition, high-impact chronic pain, that pain which has severe limitations on people's activities of daily living. That's 20 million Americans in this country. These are the high-need patients, the high utilizers, if you will, and we need a better way of actually identifying them, but then also caring for them. We followed up the Institute of Medicine report on pain with the Health and Human Services National Pain Strategy. This one I co-led with Linda Porter, brought together 80 national experts. We put forward a 17-part strategic plan. One of the key messages here: better data are needed to understand the problem and guide action. We were all scratching our heads, wondering, what we can exactly recommend to people based on the available data, and there wasn't much. So I want to shift gears, and I want to talk more about we talked about the burden of the problem, now move into some of the challenges that we have in drawing inferences from clinical research findings. Challenge number one: much of our clinical research just simply isn't relevant to our practice. Part of the issue is that much of the research that is done out there is based on randomized controlled trials. Highly selected patients that lend to high internal validity. Unfortunately, many of these trials are difficult to translate into real-world settings. They have, by definition, low external validity. And as an engineer, and I tend to think in circuits and networks, what I liken it to is a voltage drop. And what I mean by that is that when we see an RCT with this effect size, this incredible effect size, and we then bring that treatment into our clinic, I rarely ever see the same type of impact in my patients that I take care of. I think part of the problem here is illustrated by this figure. And what this figure represents is a typical situation in randomized controlled trials, whether it be in my lab, where we run large amounts of randomized controlled trials, or just about anywhere else. And that being that if you screen 100 people for a particular RCT, most likely you're only going to take 10 of them. That's the yellow people up top here. The 90 blue people don't get into those clinical trials because they ultimately have multiple comorbidities, they're on medications, they have psychiatric issues. So that means 90% of these people don't qualify. This has been well studied and published now, particularly in the psychiatric field. A friend of mine, Keith Humphreys, came out with a series of review papers in Lancet recently exposing this issue, where in the psychiatry randomized controlled trials, they typically exclude anywhere from 75 to 90% of patients that get into those trials. And yet what we do is we draw inferences from these highly homogeneous RCTs. We run through the phase 2 and 3 FDA trials. We release this out into the wild, into a population for which these treatments were never studied. And that's a real problem. They were never studied in the people like Sandra. Challenge number 2, research is really slow. It takes forever for the results of an RCT to make it into clinical practice. This quote here, this little soundbite, is one of the more frequently used ones. It's old. It's been from 2000, but it still survives today. After an average of 17 years, only 14% of research findings will have led to widespread changes in care. That's rather sad. Challenge number 3 is what I refer to as the evidence paradox. Now, after having more than 18,000 randomized controlled trials that are published every year, tens of thousands of other clinical studies involving biomarkers and endpoints, we still sit around the table and say that we don't have enough evidence to effectively inform our clinical decisions. Like many of you, I've been involved with many guidelines development where we sit around and debate the data, and much of the time we're trying to figure out, what does the data really represent, and can we draw solid conclusions? So ultimately, we need different solutions. We need more practical, more integrated approaches to how we conduct research, and we need to rely more and more, what's becoming quite popular now, this aspect of pragmatic randomized trials. This idea of bringing together clinicians, patients, healthcare systems all working together as partners, and to use that information to then build on drawing inferences from real-world patients. And at the heart of that is using what's called learning healthcare systems, which I'll define more in just a second. One last problem that we're facing all the time in the area of pain is this area of content shock. The knowledge base in pain has grown so dramatically, and we've learned so much that it's almost impossible to keep all of that in one's head. This is a network diagram that was illustrated by one of our faculty members, Ming Cao. Ming is our clinic chief. He's also a Harvard-trained biostatistician. And he thinks in networks, and it would be impossible for any clinician to be able to keep this straight in their head. So we need tools that we can ultimately take high-quality data, integrate all of this, and then draw conclusions about what we should do with the patient in front of us. And I would submit that what we need are better software platforms, better informatics platforms that help us to measure these patient outcomes, patient and clinician-reported outcomes, and put that to good use. The Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, recognized this several years ago. They put forward a 12-part series that's all freely downloadable called the Learning Healthcare System. And Learning Healthcare Systems, what they do is they call for research that is occurring closer to the actual clinical practice than in the traditional university settings or in industry settings, where you get everybody working collaboratively. These are the clinicians, the patients, the scientists, the administrators, that these occur in everyday clinical practice settings, that you link in the EMRs into this, and that ultimately these systems are recognized as being part of the greater good to help the largest number of patients possible, where ultimately evidence informs our clinical practice and the clinical practice informs the evidence. There's a growing awareness of this concept of big data. And this aspect of big data applies to learning healthcare systems too. And you can find throughout the literature what's referred to as the 6 V's of either big data or learning healthcare systems. And here, if we're going to be successful in really understanding if we're helping our patients get better, we need high volume of data. And volume typically isn't a problem. We usually have large amounts of data through our EMRs, our administrative databases. But you need high variety of data, a mixture of multiple sources so that you can appropriately model the system that you're interested in. That data has to have appropriate variability. You need to be able to account for biases and noise in your system. It needs to be valid. You need to be able to have trust of that data. We need high velocity data. Less of an issue in my world in pain, unless you're talking about things like actigraphy, where you're getting real-time streams. More of an issue when you're in the intensive care unit or in the operating room, if you're looking at real-time measurements of physiologic data. And I think all of this has to distill down to this one at the bottom, which is the data has to have value. It has to inform our clinical decision-making. That's what ultimately motivated me to develop this open source, highly flexible and free, my favorite 4-letter F word, platform for a learning healthcare system, and what we refer to as CHOIR. It has stood for the Collaborative Health Outcomes Information Registry, but I've been moving towards eliminating the acronym because the registry is a little bit too confining. But think of it as an informatics platform that allows us to collect high-quality patient outcomes and clinical outcomes for point-of-care decision-making, for biomarker and endpoint discovery, to use for clinical decision support tools, for comparative effectiveness research, and to do that research in real-world clinical settings. In this, we get a comprehensive assessment of a variety of physical, psychological, and social domains of functioning. We've been able to integrate in a number of quantitative sensory testing measures. We have leveraged much of the NIH PROMIS system. If you're interested in patient outcomes, by the way, patient-reported outcomes, if you don't know about PROMIS, this is a good space to really get educated about PROMIS. PROMIS is an investment of $120 million of our taxpayer dollars to recast all patient-reported outcomes into outcomes that are psychometrically valid using more modern educational theory techniques. It uses something called item response theory. I don't think I'm going to get to that next, am I? Yeah, I am. And I'm going to tell you in just a moment what using IRT allows you to do. Before that, let me just say that what we focused on designing and what needs to be done with these types of systems is the data needs to be very easy to capture. It has to integrate in seamlessly with your clinical work environment, that you have to give back, and I'm going to get to that momentarily, to the clinicians and others. To date, we've collected about 100,000 longitudinal data assessments across multiple institutions, including at this point, Medical College of Wisconsin, McGill in Canada, Rambam in Israel, Pittsburgh, the Phoenix VA, and others. We've now garnished a lot of insights from this data with well over 20 publications using real-world data, and as I said, we're just giving it all away with rather minimal licensing restrictions. Most important, I went into this to answer this very simple question of, are we helping our patients get better? But I've been impressed with how having high-quality data has allowed us to change the culture of how we care for patients, because no longer, when we see a patient, is it based on our opinion. We're able to look at the data in front of us and then draw inferences and appropriate recommendations. Linking back to what I said before about item response theory and PROMIS. So there's two real advantages to PROMIS outcome measures. And by the way, let me be clear also that I stripped out, because of timing, all of the typical outcome collection slides that I might use, legacy instruments and otherwise. But during the Q&A, if you have any questions about how to capture data for patients, legacy instruments for use, I'm delighted to talk about that. So IRT is based on educational theory where, back in the day, what we would do, when I took the GREs, for instance, to get into grad school, you show up with your number 2 pencil, they give you the bubble sheet, and you spend all day filling it out. Nowadays, you don't do that. They use computer adaptive testing, and now what happens is, if they're assessing your math aptitude, literally within a few questions, they know exactly what your math aptitude is, because it does a linear binary search. It starts off with a question on, say, pre-algebra, and if you get that right, it goes to, say, algebra 2. If you get that right, it goes to calculus. If you get that right, it goes to maybe differential equations. If you get that wrong, it goes back to a calculus question. Very quickly, they know your math aptitude. They still keep you in the seat half the day because they have to justify the $1,000 for giving you that exam, but they know quickly where you are. So that's CAT, and we can do the same thing with patient-reported outcomes in healthcare. The other thing it gives us is a normative metric, and that normative metric has a mean. It's a t-statistic. It's meaned at 50, and it's got a standard deviation of 10, and it's meaned across the entire US population, meaning that, and actually now Canada, as well as many other countries. And so I got to tell you, folks, I am geographically challenged, but if we're in Montreal, hopefully it's somewhere up here, you can compare that same value. If somebody has, say, a physical function score of 65, which means that they're 1.5 standard deviations above the mean, meaning they're rather impaired, you can compare that to us in Palo Alto, to Gainesville, Florida, or anywhere else in the country. And that comparator is rather powerful. I mentioned the efficiency of it. Busy slide, let me just distill it down to you. Blue column is if you were using traditional legacy instruments with collecting outcomes data on your patient. You might, in capturing these 8 different dimensions of physical, psychological, and social functioning, take 144 items to get to that. You use computer adaptive testing using a local CAT engine that we developed, 39. That leads to almost a 75% reduction in burden to your patients in capturing patient-reported outcomes. This is a real reduction in burden, and it allows you to not only do it more efficiently, end up with fewer complaints from your patients, but if you want, you can add in more stuff. We started on this in our clinic. We're a major tertiary referral center in the U.S. with now 25 faculty, strong integration with our clinical and research mission, and everything's co-located. So we got all the resources one could hope for in one space, and we started building it from there. We started off slow, and there's a big message here for all of you, and that is if you're going to start something like this, start low and go slow. The common mantra you hear in anesthesiology across everything we do, it applies here too. We started off with initial surveys that only took 2.5 minutes, and we've built up now where our initial surveys, it says 31, it's actually now up to 34 minutes. I monitor it all the time because I found that once I get up to 36 minutes, our patients start complaining more. I get more complaints. I back it off, pull some items back into the low 30s, don't hear the complaints. What we do in this is we get our complete intake questionnaire. We use an interactive body map for pain. We capture all their prior treatments, a lot of their beliefs about it. We get multiple dimensions across these PROMIS measures. We have risk tools for opioids and otherwise built into it. And we do follow-up surveys, which are obviously much briefer, currently about 13 minutes. We have expanded this into multiple sites, and so the idea is to take a platform and then customize it for other clinical conditions: peds pain, chronic fatigue, orthopedics, family medicine. What may be of interest to this group is we've also put it in the perioperative or the pre-op assessment clinic, and I'll mention that in just a moment. We've published multiple papers in these other clinical sites. So lessons learned, one of the key lessons in these types of efforts, if you undertake them, is that the number one reason why these things have failed in the past is for lack of buy-in. That you typically find a highly motivated leader who comes in and says, we're going to do this, and they start this thing and get it up and running, and then over time it dies a death of 1,000 cuts because the patients don't like it, the staff don't like it, the rest of the faculty don't like it, and ultimately it just dies off. And I've seen this time and time again. I experienced this firsthand in my institution when I tried to do this using paper and pencil instruments. I did it for 8 years and failed miserably. At the end, they were burning me in effigy outside the clinic. They were so unhappy with what I was doing. And I just put a stop to it, and I said, we have to do this differently. So the bottom line is you have to give back. And the best way to give back is give back reporting tools that the clinicians can actually use and the patients can use so that they have data, the patients have an understanding of their condition, what it means, and how you might use that information to help motivate behavioral change. So we do that with the reporting. Built into this, we have automatic note generating features. For those of you who work in clinic environments, you know that the EMR is the bane of our existence in charting. It's just a nightmare with how much time we have to spend. So what we do is we pull the Quire data in, we integrate it in with the EMR, and about 80 to 90% of one's clinical note is taken care of. We also build in opioid risk stratification tools so that we know who's at risk and who is less at risk, and then also tapering tools. I'm frequently asked, well, shouldn't we try to do this within our EMR and within Epic? And I'm a little terse in this statement. The short version is you can't do it. The reality is you can do it if you set your expectations very, very low. Epic has slowly advanced to where you can use short forms of PROMIS measures and other legacy measures. They even integrated in some of the CAT. The challenge is that Epic was never meant to do this kind of thing. It was meant to bill your patients, to schedule your patients. It was never meant to handle modern patient-reported outcomes. It was never meant to ultimately close the loop on the data to help provide clinical decision support tools. It was meant to bill your patients and schedule them. The same with REDCap. I use REDCap for all of our clinical trials. I love REDCap. I'm one of the biggest fans of what Vanderbilt has built. But the issue with REDCap is that it's built on a different philosophical framework. It's much more project performant, meaning that if you have a clearly defined study that you want to execute, a randomized controlled trial, REDCap is amazing. Go use REDCap. But if you want to have a system in your clinic that is very flexible and dynamic, that you can pull surveys or items and pull them out, push them in, that's where you need something that is based on a more modern type of platform. We use what's called a NoSQL backend, which basically means it's kind of an asynchronous way of storing data. Facebook uses this, others. It just means you can throw any kind of data you want into it, and it doesn't matter. You just tell it the structure of the data, and it stores it. So where we need to be moving with these types of systems is to be able to do this rapid iteration, to be able to, in the Silicon Valley parlance, fail early, fail frequently. And that is, do your environmental scan of what you've identified as your problem in your clinical setting, put forward a hypothesis, quickly go and capture that data and put together your intervention, test it rapidly with the expectation it's not going to work, and do that iteratively until you reach a solution that actually does work. And we've done this multiple times now. I'm going to show you some examples of how we've been doing that at our institution using this type of data. I'm going to show you some examples across the research spectrum as well as in the clinical practice setting. And some examples being where we've used this to gather preliminary data for ultimate grant support, where we've been using this now for comparative effectiveness trials and pragmatic trials, where we use it to track all of our patients as well as the systems of treatment within our clinic. The goal here, the goal is to turn our clinics into research labs. Turn our clinics into research labs where every single patient is informing us with high quality data that will ultimately use to help inform their care. It doesn't mean to turn our patients into lab rats and experiment on them. We don't do that. And we can talk, by the way, if people have questions about the ethics and the IRB and where this fits within the common rule at the end, I'm delighted to have those discussions too. So, going back to Sandra, just using a specific person example, patient example, PROMIS measures are such that higher scores are typically worse functioning. So she came in highly elevated across multiple domains of physical, psychological, and social functioning across the board. She surprisingly had not been put on a simple tricyclic for her CRPS. So we did that. I've been studying a drug called low-dose naltrexone for several years. I published a couple papers on it in fibromyalgia. You're all used to thinking of this in the context of treating addiction. At low doses, it's thought to be a toll-like 4 receptor antagonist blocking microglial activation and neuroimmune reactivity. So we've had some good success with it. And then I also do brain zapping. I've got a research platform around transcranial magnetic stimulation. So she comes back. She's markedly better across the board in just about every domain that you can imagine. She's just doing much, much better, except for one. And I usually call out to the audience and ask if they can tell me what it is, but for the sake of time, because this is a little bit of a shorter talk, it's this guy here. It's physical function. She's just really not budging at all. So we ended up bringing in a targeted intervention, and this was a healthcare educator, Rachel, who worked with setting goal-oriented behaviors. She wanted to hike more, walk more. We had her fill out activity tracking and goal tracking, and then we find a significant improvement in her physical function. So that's a single patient. But how does that information start to inform us more broadly? Well, we started off with several approaches. This is a first approach where we just let the data speak for itself. And here, this was actually developed and run by Meng Cao again. We did what's called a Bayesian network reconstruction approach. So we threw all the data into the kitchen sink and we let the data kind of self-form nodes and network connections to understand how they were interacting within the context of pain to see which nodes were most relevant. And what we found actually surprised us. This is many, many thousands of patients that we see. And what surprised us here, it wasn't often the usual suspects. And in fact, the biggest predictor, the biggest factor here was social isolation. That was a very strong one. PC stands for pain catastrophizing. That comes up frequently in the research literature. But another one here that came up was fatigue. So we use this data-driven approach, and then we go forward with more hypothesis-driven research. This was one of the earlier studies that we did, led by Drew Sturgeon, former postdoc, now a faculty at the University of Washington in Seattle. And he did a Bayesian network he did a structural equation model on cross-sectional data and building on the typical story. So the typical story we all know is that when your pain goes up, your physical function goes down, you get depressed, you get anxious. But what really happens when you model it appropriately, your pain goes up, your physical function goes down. That leads to a reduction in your satisfaction with your engaging with your friends and family. Your social functioning is going down. That leads you to become depressed and angry. Now, by the way, I want to be clear in that. You can't, from cross-sectional data, cannot draw causal influences here. You need longitudinal data for that. But it does show some nice associations that you can use to build on. And then we built on that more recently. This says accepted in 2018. It was actually just published a few months ago. This one was led by Nick Karayanis, also working with Drew. We took that social functioning aspect and we asked this question: is it that when people's pain interference goes up, their social isolation, their social functioning goes down, or vice versa, or is it a bidirectional relationship? And the take-home message here is it was absolutely counterintuitive. In other words, it's not that your pain interference gets worse and you become more socially isolated. Interestingly, you become more socially isolated and then your pain interference gets worse. As I said, it's completely counterintuitive to us. Now you remember, by the way, in this earlier slide that I showed you here, this lack of change across physical function. I was intrigued by this because I was seeing this in just about every patient that I was treating in the clinic. We would put them through a variety of therapies. I'd see their I would see their pain interference better, their emotional functioning improve, but their physical function wouldn't get better. And I was asking myself, is it just my patients or is this reflective as a whole? And why do we even care about this? Well, why we care about this is because just about every national guideline in the United States and in Canada and in Europe says that we have to measure two things with our patients: pain and functioning. Pain and functioning. And yet if you go into the guidelines and you look typically in the appendices, what they recommend that you measure for physical function, they all have a common thread. They're all recommending the measurement of pain interference. This I pulled from Washington State. I'm not picking on them in particular. It just happened to make for an easy screenshot. And here, in the last month, how much has pain interfered with your daily activities as a way of assessing physical function? And the question is pain interference the same as physical function? So we did what's called a latent growth model, where we modeled data over time, pain interference and physical function, and it's a little bit of a busy slide, but let me just give you the soundbite to this, and that is they don't track each other at all. That over time, they diverge completely. And the bottom line is that pain interference is not a good surrogate measure for physical function, and yet just about every national clinical guideline out there uses it. Meaning, in the end, the guidelines are all recommending the measurement of the right thing, but the wrong way. And so, it's this type of inference you can get from real-world data, high-quality real-world data, to inform policy. I mentioned there was another node there that came out, and that was fatigue. And the long and the short of it is, once again, in another structural equation model that Drew did, we found that all directions, all paths from increasing in pain and depression and sleep interference disturbance to reductions in pain, to reductions in physical function, all go through fatigue. And interestingly, in our clinics, we don't really talk about fatigue. We don't typically ask patients about fatigue. And I think part of it is because we don't have very good treatments for fatigue. But what's showing up to us is that there is a great need to target this thing and pay more attention to it. By the way, how we've translated the data from the social functioning, which turns out to be probably the most important thing in our patients, is we've now put in multiple self-management groups in our clinic. We've partnered up with Penny Cowan at the American Chronic Pain Association. We support a chronic pain self-management group within our clinic. It's rather cheap. It just costs me cookies and coffee once a month. And a great turnout, and it provides a wonderful social milieu for our patients. We also implemented something called the Patient Family Advisory Committee to get more engagement from the family in how we run the clinic and how we integrate in the patient's voice and the family's voice into the clinic operations. Turning, as we're bringing this in for some closure, I love this quote from George Box, a noted statistician: "All models are wrong, but some are useful." So what he has been critical of is the typical assumptions we make on all data. You know, the data is linear, it follows a normal distribution, and frequently our real-world data does not, in fact, do that. So this was a study that was led by Beth Darnell, who is a pain psychologist in the group, my partner, and she has an interest in sex differences in pain and opioid use. And the short version here is she went on to ask this question: are there differences in the way men and women use opioids and are likely to be prescribed an opioid? And what we find here is that the answer is yes, that if you're a man, you're much more likely to be on opioids for high pain intensity. If you're a woman, it's because you have greater pain catastrophizing. Catastrophizing, by the way, for those who don't know, is a trifecta made up of 3 dimensions. It is a negative amplification of that thing, rumination, repetitive thoughts, and a sense of helplessness or loss of control. What I thought was most interesting out of that data, and this figure actually didn't get published, the reviewers, for whatever reason, told us to pull it out, but I thought it was the best figure of all, is this pooled data with men and women and the effect, the likelihood of being, you know, prescribed an opioid against pain catastrophizing. And what we find here is that most people pay attention to this area of extreme pain catastrophizing, levels of 30, 31 and above. But what we found is that this subclinical range here, this area in the upper teens and 20s, is actually rather important. And we wouldn't have picked this up unless we applied a general additive model to this data to better curve fit, if you will, to better fit the actual distribution of it. If we had applied just a standard linear model, and we did, just to see what happened, all of these findings washed out, and we were just left with the typical party line of only the high levels matter. So we've got this sense of catastrophizing now. So Dr. Darnell has been interested in targeting this. So the problem with treating this condition, remember that showed up as a major node in our Bayesian network reconstruction and other data. The problem with treating this is it takes 8 weeks of cognitive behavioral therapy. Our patients don't want to show up for it. We have a hard time getting them in. So she developed a 2-hour single session class. We ran 57 people through this session, which just focuses on pain catastrophizing. We showed rather significant reductions across the board in physical, psychological, and social functioning, capturing this data using Quire. We spun this data around and immediately was able to turn it into a $5 million R01. Now the point of that is that this type of quality data can be used for rapid prototyping, for quick types of studies that you can use for your grant applications. Pamela Flood, who I haven't seen here but must be here because I heard Steve is here. Pamela is here. Just got this accepted into regional anesthesia. Oh, Franklin Dexter here. He's the guy that ran the stats on this. You know, applause for Franklin. What Pamela did was she was interested in asking this question around the area of Botox that we use for the treatment of migraine headache. And we took 183 subjects here and was able to take the Quire data and be able to model this to determine both, is there a real effect in real-world patients? And the answer is yes. And then what are the predictors of that effect? And it turns out people, as you might expect, lower in depression, lower in fatigue, tended to have a better response to Botox than others. And so we're now building on this and capturing this data at more defined time points. Bringing some closure once again, we've put this in a perioperative environment. We built on some work that was started by Ian Carroll, Jen Ha, and myself, where we very manually and laboriously collected data on people coming into surgery to characterize them at baseline and then after surgery. And we spent 5 years collecting 700 patients. We published a multitude of papers. There's a sampling of some of these on developing predictors of persistent pain and opioid use after surgery using a lot of Cox proportional hazard ratio modeling for time to opioid cessation, time to pain resolution. The problem is it takes forever to do that, and it spends a lot of NIH funds. So we ended up putting Quire in the pre-op clinic, and instead of 5 years to collect 700 people, in 1 year we collected 9,000 for free. And so what we're able to do is get people before surgery, and they fill out all the intake questionnaire for your preoperative assessment clinic. We get all the PROs, and then it automatically sends out surveys afterwards. I don't have the data because I'll run out of time in showing what we've done to predict length of stay with this kind of data. I'm delighted to answer questions. So once again, bringing closure, we're trying to help achieve this goal of the 6 V's of learning healthcare systems and big data to ultimately provide us with actionable data. Some of the lessons that we've learned here is that when you start this in your systems, embrace failure. Expect to fail, particularly early on. The IT challenges here are swamped by the operations challenges and the political challenges in your organization. You got to get all the stakeholders involved. Keep it simple. Start small, go slow. You need good communication amongst everyone. And by the way, I've said that this is all free that we're giving away, but in full disclosure, I view free like giving you a free puppy. Yeah, it's free, but you got to feed the puppy and you got to take it outside and walk the puppy. These things do take maintenance from your internal organization. And the other thing that I've learned is for these things ultimately to be successful, we're going to have to move it all into the cloud. Where we're going in the future with this, and this we've actually already got up and running, we're integrating in using something called Smart on Fire technology. It's an open standard, open source API that allows application communication with EMRs. And this is all to get it integrated into your local EMR so it's seamless. Putting it into the cloud, which we've also achieved. Targeted intervention tracking and point-of-care pragmatic trials. Vafi Salmasi, that good-looking guy there, gave a study at the mentoring session a couple hours ago showing how he's been using it for his FAIR grant to do point-of-care pragmatic trials within the clinic, and then to develop ultimately more tools for clinicians like visualizations and dashboards. The last thing I think was pretty cool, this we just in the last year started doing, is we're trying to flip the whole concept of registries on its head. Rather than aggregating data across multiple institutions, we have developed the technology where you can do what's called a distributed computational registry, where everybody's data stays local, but you distribute through a network the analysis code. And from that, you develop, you get a sufficient statistic that is iteratively worked on until you converge on an exact solution. And what you can get is an exact solution in the same way as if you brought everybody's data together. I didn't invent this in full disclosure, our statisticians did, but we think that's pretty cool. Ultimately, we want to take this so that we're able to help inform the care of Sandra and everybody like her. This is her. She just had her second child here and is doing much better. She still has CRPS. She still has some limitations, but she works full-time. She cares for her kids. And that's what this is ultimately all about. This is a list of all the manuscripts, which you cannot see. But if you email me at Mackey@stanford.edu, I'll send you a copy, a PDF of all of the slides and the manuscripts if anybody's interested. And finally, my thanks to all of our collaborators and then the people in our group that get this work done. I'm really just the talking head. All right, I talked a little fast to get through all this in this time, but I want to take a moment and answer any questions you have. I show still a few minutes here, but we may be right at the time to transition. But thank you all for coming. Thanks for your interest. And once again, delighted to answer any questions you have. All right, anybody? And by the way, if there's somebody else who has to give a lecture next. Come on up. I don't want to interrupt you, and we'll get you set up while we're doing this, and then we'll move out. Any thoughts, any questions, feedback, criticisms, experiences you had yourself with capturing quality data in your group, in your institution? Yes.
Hi, my name's Jan Karstomiu. I'm an anesthesiologist who's been running a pretty much solo practice in chronic pain management for the past 20 years. I do not do interventions anymore at all. And how can I profit from this?
Well, I think that starting slow, and capturing some basic data in your patients using simple systems, can go a long way. I mean, if you don't have the resources to kind of go with more of an enterprise level system like what I'm talking about here, they've got RedCap in the cloud, and just setting up some simple surveys, or even there's a number of other electronic data capture systems that you can use. And again, if it were me, I would just start off with something simple like getting a pain interference, a pain intensity, getting some stuff, one sleep measure, one fatigue measure, just starting there. Are you already doing that?
Oh, for 20 years.
Okay.
So,
Are you using the data?
the data is not very useful.
That's the challenge, yeah.
So the data is not very useful. And my concern, or not a concern because I don't know enough about it to be really concerned, is if this is going to be used to help clinicians, somebody like me, to direct treatment, use a particular drug, recommend some kind of intervention, okay, how does this offer controls? For example, some of us are less than thrilled by our experiences in the literature on acupuncture, and other people are recommending it. And I've read tons of debates in this very journal about it. And how do I decide to tell my patients, if my patient asks me, is acupuncture useful? And I think I've read the latest stuff in the literature, but I see your pain clinic is using it. For example, I'm just using this as an example, not as an accusation. Do you understand what I'm trying to get at?
Absolutely. And I don't think anybody, myself included, took it as an accusation. You're right, we do use it. We use it very much as a treatment in our clinic. I don't understand it. I don't know if it works. I just finished up a $10 million NIH grant to try to figure out what the mechanisms are of it, and mindfulness-based stress reduction and cognitive behavioral therapy. Taxpayers just funded a huge amount into us to try to figure it out. I still don't know if it works. I've got a couple faculty members who are big believers in it. We have collected a fair amount of data on it using Choir. I didn't show this, and there's some real sex differences around responses to acupuncture, and then also with some of the quantitative sensory testing using pressure dolorometry that seems to be somewhat predictive of it. At the end of the day, I don't know if it works. I know that's not very satisfying, but I just want to be intellectually honest with you. Do I send my patients to it? I say, yeah, if you can afford the wallet biopsy, go give it a try, because there's little downside to it. That's the nice thing. There's little downside. And the people I do see it helping, migraine, it seems to, for some people, seems to work, some low back pain, not as much for some other conditions. I'm just keeping an open mind on it and trying to collect the quality data so that we can ultimately answer your question, an answer I don't have right now. That's the problem we have. I started off in the beginning of the slide when I said that our randomized controlled trials are not informing clinical practice. If you ask an acupuncturist, does it work? They'll say absolutely, and they'll point you to all the RCTs. If you ask an epidemiologist or somebody who's reviewing high-quality data, they'll say there's no data to support its use, because they're each drawing different thresholds on where they'll accept a study into their, their stuff. So, yeah, we got a lot of work to do. Good points. Other questions, other thoughts, comments? Yeah.
I'm just thinking of Andrew 7, UK. I'm just thinking of Andrew Moore, from the Oxford unit that does bandolier, and he did a nice little review of this a couple of years ago, entitled "Expect Failure."
Yeah. You call it entitled what?
Expect failure.
Ah, yeah.
You know, and it was turning on its head the whole idea that we should just be focusing on treatments with sort of that are known to work with low numbers to treat, and say, well, actually, they're the easy ones. You know, it's the others that we actually have to worry about, isn't it? It's the ones who don't respond. It's the non-responders who are the focus of our activity. They're the ones who've fallen off. They're the 90% who've not been
Yes, absolutely. And it's, you know, also we report on population means in these studies, yet we don't take care of populations, we take care of people. And, you know, we all know from within the data, there are responders, there are non-responders to it. And, you know, a big part of what we do as clinicians is to figure out, you know, which of these treatments might this person really be a responder to. You know, there's a large number of these pain treatments I use that never passed the FDA, that didn't pass the phase 3 trials. Oxcarbazepine, you know, never got approved as a pain medication, and yet I use it as a sodium channel blocker, and a number of people seem to get a really good response to it. But it failed the trials on a population basis. To agreeing with your point and just expanding on it. Yeah. Other questions, thoughts?
Can you briefly comment on the IRB piece of it that you had alluded to?
Yeah, so one of the, I'm surprised nobody brought this up, you know, because we're collecting data on all of our patients, right? And then we're publishing papers on it, and yet I don't consent our patients. How the hell am I getting away with that? Well, I'll tell you, we were in close contact with our IRB all the time, and they kept coming back over and over again, and they said, are you using this predominantly for clinical care purposes? And we answered truthfully, yes, we are. Do we need to consent our patients? And they kept coming back and they said, no, you don't. You're using it for clinical care purposes. But if you end up wanting to publish on this or do research on it, you need to file for a retrospective IRB. So we have a broad retrospective IRB that allows us to mine the data and to then publish on it. And what we have put in place are systems where we have one IRB for all of the data mining. And then we have a research proposal for Quire where anybody can put forward a proposal. It gets vetted by a small committee that just looks at it from feasibility for impact and to make sure it's not overlapping with something else. If it gets approved, they get access to the data. Now, that's one scenario. The other scenario is like what Dr. Salmasi is doing with his pragmatic trial that's baked into Quire. That's a prospective study moving forward. In that case, we do an electronic consent. And they get a simple IRB consent within Quire that they read and then check off a box on. Another approach is, let's say one of my postdocs wants to study, most recently it was the effect of anger in pain. He wanted to throw a whole bunch of anger instruments in. I couldn't justify that as clinical care. And I said, Gotti, we got to go get an IRB. And so the patients at the end of Quire are invited to participate in a research study. If they do, they fill out a brief electronic consent, and then if they say yes, they go and fill out the surveys. And then what I haven't shared with you is we've developed a cool system within Quire to tap into the Amazon API for payment. And so now, as soon as somebody finishes the surveys for any of our studies, they immediately get a gift card sent to them. And so that helps reduce the issues that we've had at Stanford, where typically it takes us 4 to 6 weeks to cut a check to a patient to reimburse them. By the way, from a research standpoint, one other thing is we've got baked into this an OK to contact database where we ask patients if we can contact them for future research studies of any type. And that's led to tens of thousands of patients enrolled, which acts as a great milieu for our other research studies. So again, too many things to try to cram into this brief time. Any other questions? And again, if people need to leave, move on to the next session, the next speaker needs to get going, please do so. I'll keep answering questions. And okay. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your time in Montreal.